Hello, welcome to Heroes of the Coast. I'm Janet Bridgers with Earth Alert, and I'm very pleased today to be here with my guest, Bill Kortum. Bill Kortum is a coastal activist of long duration, and Bill, thank you for making it down here to Pacifica Studios here.
A pleasure. Be this close to the ocean.
So tell me how it began for you to become involved in coastal issues. How and when?
Well, had good basis for it, living in Petaluma within, half-hour drive to the ocean, and folks would take us out there for picnics and abalones, and it's a great day for a kid coming out of a little town of 5,000. And
oh, you grew up in Petaluma?
yeah, right. Born and raised there.
Really?
But it was always there as a great treat, a big contrast to the rest of Sonoma County, and we were very proud of that coast. You could go up there and go in almost any place, or give the rancher $1 and park your car and go down to the tide pool or the beach. Anyway, after I graduated from veterinary school, I practiced for a year or so in Petaluma, went away to the Army for a couple of years, came back and started my own practice, Lucy and myself, in Cotati, a little town central to the other towns of Sonoma County. And suddenly it was announced that PG&E was going to build a power plant at Bodega Head. Bodega Head is one of the few, maybe 3 or 4 headlands in the whole state coastline. And I wasn't very concerned about that. I was kind of sorry that we had to have industrialization of the coastline. Was that necessary? And then it developed that it was going to be a nuclear power plant, one of the first built in the West Coast.
The story that I read that was very interesting, that how that came out was Hazel Mitchell, was that the woman's name? A waitress who overheard the conversation by the PG&E executives?
Yeah. Right.
It hadn't been disclosed before that
No,
it's going to be a nuclear power plant?
reluctant to admit that that's what they had in mind. And then I came very alive, because as a veterinarian, young practicing guy starting in the dairy industry up there as a dairy practitioner, about the dangers of radiation, because in veterinary school they really hammered home that it's nothing to play with. And so I started doing some reading and investigation, and found out that these plants did give off iodine-131, which comes out of this so-called stack that comes out of a nuclear power plant to get the gases up into the air. And you get iodine-131 contamination of pastures, and cows pick this up by eating grass, and it deposits in their parathyroids, and they excrete it in their milk. So 2 things. One is we love that coast and wanted to save it as we knew it in childhood. And 2, this was a direct economic threat to the Sonoma County dairy industry. And so I started preaching as a every client I got was very valuable to me, but I started preaching about the dangers of radiation. Pretty soon PG&E heard about it, and they got all the dairymen in a room and told them how wrong I was. I knew I was right.
This was, they said that in the article that this was to be the first commercially viable nuclear power plant in California,
right.
But that they had another one that was a test plant. Explain to me how that worked. Was it a smaller plant?
Yeah, it was a pilot plant, and they built it up just this side of the Eureka, and work with the rods and so on that they have in one of these plants. And it was a pilot that Bodega Head plant was going to be 15 times as big, And so what I did was get a hold of one of my colleagues up there and asked if he had any dairymen just downwind from the plant, and if he'd see to it that I could get a parathyroid gland out of one of the slaughtered cows. And he's a neat guy, and we waited a couple months, and sure enough, he sent one down by Greyhound, and I took it down to Berkeley, and there it was, iodine 131. And so I knew I was right. I mean, they had built this plant upwind from a schoolhouse right across the street. That's how careless they were in those days. And it was a very simple design, something like a boiling tea kettle. And to think they'd make one 15 times as large at Bodega Head was very threatening. And to see that coastline start to, particularly a very valuable headland, we don't have many of them, because they want to pump the water through the plant and to the other side so they can cool the plant. And to lose that to industrialization, big power lines coming across the headlands, down across the bay and on into the inland, was the beginning of things, raising my conscience.
What form did your organized efforts against the plant take?
Well, I wasn't the center of it. I kind of played the periphery. It was pretty much driven by San Francisco and Berkeley types. My brother, Carl, who was the head of the San Francisco Maritime Museum, kind of led the fight at its very beginning. He sat down and wrote a letter to the Chronicle about the dangers of nuclear power and the industrialization of our coastline, because he too would go along on our abalone trips in those periods. And he was a maritime historian and had great love for the coast. He spent a whole weekend writing a simple letter to the editor and took it into his friend Scott Newhall, who was the editor of the San Francisco Chronicle. They were great old buddies. They loved ships and junkyards and so on. And Scott knew that PG&E shouldn't be scorned in San Francisco. It was the dear industry of San Francisco. Their headquarters were there and so on. You never said anything against PG&E. So he went ahead anyway and had the letter published, and he said he left town for 3 days because he knew his publisher would almost fire him. But did it ever raise Cain? From that, Carl suggested that people write a letter to the Public Utilities Commission and have them reopen the hearings in Bodega Head, because they had already said okay.
What year was this?
And this was, 61, 62. I'm not good on dates. And 1,500 letters were written from that one letter to the editor, and they reopened the hearings. And that got a lot of publicity and got the thing off and running. And so I, in the meantime, went to a local editor of the Sebastopol Times. He had just bought the paper, and he wanted to make a big splash in Sonoma County. He's a very right-wing kind of guy, but I knew him through a mutual friend. And I took him a paper that had been written by David Pessinen, who later took on the whole battle for those many years. He just sat down and wrote a story about an atomic park, I think is the name of the pamphlet. And so I took that paper to Ernie Joyner, and he loved it. He put it in, it was a weekly paper, and every week he'd have bold headlines in the front of this little town newspaper about the Pessinen paper and the dangers of nuclear power and putting that thing in Bodega Head. Well, he lost 40% of his advertising. That's the kind of guy he was. But that gave the whole fight some legitimacy, because Sonoma County wanted that plant in the worst way. The Board of Supervisors, the tax base, how could you be against this thing? So that really set a tone to get that published. In the meantime, my neighbor across the street was, boy, I'm forgetting his name, was the originator of West Coast jazz, and he had retired, hadn't picked up his trumpet for 10 years, and but he is a rock collector, and he knew Bodega Head very well and knew that whole coastline. He's always going out there and studying geology, and so he come across the street to the veterinary hospital and weep on my shoulder about destruction of Bodega Head, and his wife suggested that he get his friend Turk Murphy out of San Francisco, bring his jazz band up to the Head, and which he did, and oh darn. Anyway, he picked up his trumpet the first time in 10 years. He wrote a piece, Blues Over Bodega, and they went out there and had a jazz festival, and they had balloons with a little tag on them. It said, this could be a nucleotide from the Bodega Head nuclear power plant when it's built, and please send the postcard back in, or words to that effect.
Great idea.
And they landed all over the Bay Area, one in the town square of Santa Fe. And every time one would land, the local papers would pick it up. So it was, from a publicity standpoint, it kept going. You know, it wasn't just a one event type of thing. So then there's a long story of how it evolved then from finding the earthquake fault and the Atomic Energy Commission and the National Geological Survey people out of San Mateo. I could go into more of that, but it finally evolved into when they dug the hole. They were 75 feet deep to put this reactor in. The Pessaman had arranged to have this internationally recognized geologist come up. Well, let me go into that story. Carl and Dave Pessaman put on a rally in Santa Rosa, and just about the dangers of nuclear power and so on. And Governor Brown had what he called his atomic specialists there to defend nuclear energy. And about halfway through the meeting, he rose up from the back of the audience and lectured them like a father lecturing his kids, that you guys don't know anything about this thing, and you ought to go home and forget about this, and so on. Well, that was on KPF radio. They were recording it. They sent the tape down to its equivalent in Los Angeles. It was played down there, and this geologist was in his car, and he heard this broadcast. And so he called up Pessaman and said, "What can I do for you?" And Pessaman said, "Come on up and see the hole in the head. Maybe you can help us out." And so he did go up there, and they climbed down into the hole one evening when nobody's around. Sure enough, there's a branch of the San Andreas Fault going right through it. So that evolved then, PG&E hiring UC Berkeley geologists to say you're wrong, and then the resources agency, it's not the agency, it's Interior Department, National Interior Department, sent geologists from the San Mateo office up to confirm this, and they did, and said, you know, it truly is an earthquake fault. And that got back to the Atomic Energy Commission, and they were pretty much forced to shut it down.
So they withdrew it.
Yeah. So we didn't win the fight. We just let Mother Nature do that for us. But it was that buildup of that public awareness of nuclear power and the dangers near a nuclear power plant.
Now, how much time was that before that happened and when you became involved in the Sea Ranch issue?
So that was 62,
Uh-huh.
and it trot through subsequent events because of my activity in that nuclear power plant fight. I was asked by the governor to serve on what was called the Redwood Road Committee, where we wanted to see how you'd make a scenic highway out of Highway 1 from Oregon border down to Santa Barbara. It allowed me to rub elbows with a lot of other activists, including George Collins, who did the original study of every potential park site on the Pacific coast, hired by the federal government to do that. And in our travels, we found the Salt Point Ranch, which he had picked out years before as a potential park, just like he picked Bodega Head, Point Reyes, Willow Creek, you name it. For anyone that was any piece of land that could be a local park, city, state, national, he put on a map. So he described this whole thing to us. He said, this Salt Point, this is one of them, 3,000 acres. And so I was on the school board at the time, and I said, they'll make a great, well, I didn't say that. I was picking up a little booklet that put out by the Johnson Great Society about what you do for outdoor education that said, buy yourself a tide pool. And it all came clear that that's what we're going to use to get the state to buy Salt Point. We got the whole educational establishment behind that. The state park people reached down into stole some money from Southern California and bought 3,000 acres for $1,000 an acre.
Wow.
So, wow, triumph. And almost the next day, you might say, when the ink was dry, the Press Democrat announced that Castle and Cook had bought the Olson Ranch, now the Sea Ranch, 13 miles of public coastline, and had made a deal in the back room with the Board of Supervisors to give them exclusive right to that piece of coastline, no public access. In exchange for that, we got a little park in the north end at the Wallowa. And that angered me, and as we went to the various hearings that were going on this Sea Ranch proposal, I found fellow shipmates, you might say, that felt the same anger as I did. You know, that's public commons. You ought to have a right to go down to it. And it's not till a year later that we learned, or should have known, that it's written right into the Constitution, Article 15, Section 2, that you have a right to get to the coast.
I want you to repeat that, because I'm not sure that all the people who see this know that the California Constitution
Exactly.
gives every Californian the right to access the wet sand.
Right. Mm-hmm. And that we owned it up to the mean high tide. So we got nowhere with the public hearings, and so we started an initiative that every time a piece of coastal property is subdivided, you have to provide public access. And it's been a hot summer gathering the signatures, and spent $1,500 to buy one ad in the Press Democrat, thinking public's going to vote for this. Why should they vote against their best interest? But 2 weeks before the election, Castle and Cook put $40,000 into a professional campaign group, and they defeated us. Surprise to all of us that people would vote against their best interest. It shows what good advertising and so on can do to turn something around. Anyway.
So Sea Ranch to this day is an exclusive piece of property without public access?
No, because of the Coastal Commission, Sea Ranch wanted to change some zoning, and the county planners forced them to give us a coastal trail on the upper 1/3. part of the California Coastal Trail. And someday we'll work out something so we can get through, because the California Coastal Trail is important fallout from this. So
that would have been, and when did that initiative take place?
Initiative was in 1968, I believe, or 7.
Okay, so
Right.
you're getting close to. Now, what were you doing when the Santa Barbara oil spill happened?
Well, then things started to happen during the time we were thinking about the initiative, actually, when we were testifying against Sea Ranch. That was when GOO was taking place.
Get oil out.
Yeah, get oil out. And so Alan Cerroti had been urged by Ellen Stern Harris that we got to do something about protecting the coast. And Alan's idea was that we should have a coastal commission. And so he and John Dunlap came over because they were incensed that the public had voted against their own access, something wrong here, and had public hearings on the county giving away access to 13 miles of coast. If you did that for the rest of the California coast, we wouldn't have anything left. And so then after those hearings, and then I forgot, to do the initiative, we formed an organization, Californians Organized to Acquire Access to State Tideland, COAST, with 2 A's. And we kept COAST going for 25 years, various things. And so they asked COAST, or COAST invited them to a luncheon, and they asked us to put together a coalition up and down the coastline to help them in the California legislature to get a coastal commission underway. And so a number of us went down to see the GOO people, and we put together between GOO and Coast, and there at the time they were going to mine the mouth of the Russian River for gravel to bed the bark tubes in, barge it down. And there were threats of desalinization plants. Well, I can name a whole list of challenges to the coast at the time. For instance, Fort Bragg was just dumping their garbage over a coastal bluff, and the beach up there below it became known as Glass Beach. And up at Lake Earl, up in Del Norte County, the county let a lake bottom be subdivided for a subdivision when, if you dig down with a shovel 8 inches below, you run into the water table. That kind of carelessness. You know, and mobile home parks being built on coastal bluffs and so on. There was a real need. I couldn't name the 12 groups that we got together, but it all kind of gelled together at that time, and I became the chairman of this coalition. It was pretty much just a front organization.
You were the chairman.
Yeah, right.
Where would you meet, or you didn't have conference calls?
No, it's
a lot of
1,200
driving
miles
around,
of coastline, the length of California.
Meet in the middle?
We didn't have internet, you know. You just do it by letter. Just
wow,
impossible. But you could tell the legislature you had a coalition, and each one of them would write letters. And
I see. And when did Janet? Well, Cerroti and Dunlap tried to get legislation passed.
In '69.
Right.
And then the coalition decided that we needed a live wire to really run with this thing in the legislature. Janet Adams had brilliantly put together a campaign to save San Francisco Bay. And the legislature eventually, under pressure from Janet Adams, put together Bay Conservation Development Commission, which sought to control of all development of bayshore properties around the 600 miles of San Francisco Bay. And she pulled some great stunts. She had people send bay mud in envelopes up to their legislature and say, you know, want to save this. And she was just brilliant at it. So it didn't take much to talk her into doing this. We couldn't pay her anything. So for a year or so, I don't know if we ever paid her anything. But we mounted this campaign in the legislature then in 1970, 71, 72 to help Cerrone Dunlap get their legislation through. And there were conflicting bills. The main difference was that Pete Wilson had a bill, the former governor, that would leave the control still in the hands of local jurisdictions. You know, you've got 25 cities and you got 15 counties, and they had been so careless up to then allowing development with no kind of statewide sense that this is a very valuable resource and shouldn't be just given away to everybody who comes along and wants to develop the coast. But Pete Wilson wanted to keep it that way, and Cerrone Dunlap said, look, you've got to have a central planning process. Well, that rang a bell with me because one of the people on this Redwood Road Committee was the Lawrence Halpern, the famous landscape architect, and he had designed Sea Ranch. And he told Castle and Cook, you ought to provide for public access, and they wouldn't listen to him. But he said to our group, trying to make Highway 1 into a scenic highway, look you're up against a brick wall. You can't do this unless you have planning control over the land use on each side of Highway 1. You need a coastal commission type of thing. He said it way back then when we were running up and down the coastline looking at these possibilities. And I always remember that. So when Alan and John Dunlap came along and talked about a commission, that was just the thing to do.
Then, as you and I both well know, and probably many of our viewers, it didn't get past the legislature.
No, it didn't. But it was necessary to have that 3-year exposure to the public, because at the time, Jerry Brown was Secretary of State. And so when I remember the situation in the halls of the legislature, Janet and I and the chief lobbyist for John were walking down the hall together, and these 3 lobbyists came along, represent the California Real Estate Association, the League of Cities, and the Supervisors Association, or it might have been the realtors. And they stopped us in the hall and said, look, you're never going to get this thing through this legislature. Why don't you use the initiative process? And of course that made Janet furious because she'd already thought of that. I don't know what the conversation was, but from then on, that's what we did to put Prop 20 there. Legislature was tough. They admitted later that they had a meeting every week figuring how they were going to outmaneuver us. And that would be those named, the power companies of California, the California Real Estate Association, I don't know their formal name. As I say, the League of California Cities, who are possessive of that local control. Same way with the Association of County Supervisors, and 2 or 3 others. And they strategize every week to keep us from passing that Dunlap-Cerrone bill.
Ellen Stern Harris told me that the good thing about having tried to get it through the legislature, though, was that it had been vetted enough that you knew who was against it, you knew what their arguments were, and you knew exactly how to fight back on those issues.
And typically of initiatives, they're many times just put on spontaneously and the public doesn't know anything about them. Well, we had educated the public for 3 years by having Jerry Brown there, then later as governor. The press was very interested in Sacramento. There are all kinds of press people and television people in Sacramento. And so we got a lot of coverage of our battle. So we essentially had done our education by the time we got the signatures on Prop 20. And as Ellen said, we knew what would work and what wouldn't work. There were lots of hearings on it, what you could do and couldn't do, and so on and so forth. So it was a good piece of legislation.
So did you have a particular role in the initiative campaign, or were you just in charge of Sonoma County? Or?
Yeah, pretty much just Sonoma County, yeah, and getting it across.
Which is still a pretty big piece of accounting.
Well, yeah, we're good voters up there.
Do you remember the margin by which it passed in Sonoma
55.
County?
Oh, up there? Yeah, it was more than 55, I think, in Sonoma County. I forget what it was.
So that was 72.
Right.
So then I know that you then, what did you do after that? Did you take a vacation? Did you go just?
Well, they had, created 5 regional commissions. This is said to be the largest planning commission in charge of the largest piece of real estate in the world under one planning commission. Traditionally, you do planning at a local level so the public can get up there and complain and appeal and so on. But that's the way the coasts have been handled up to then, and the electeds were much too soft and were essentially giving the coast away. So the point of it is that you have a statewide planning commission, but it was set up so you could take your cases to a local coastal commission, usually 2 or 3 counties. And I thought maybe they'd appoint me to one of the local commissions anyway, but I think traditionally the people making the appointments are very political, and they don't want activists sitting on those commissions. Anyway, I was not appointed to any of the commissions ever.
Well, you obviously became busy nonetheless again as a founding member of the California League of Conservation Voters. When did that happen?
Well, after we had the coalition in '69, we formed the California Coastal Alliance and jumped from 12 members to 110 members. And so we had a sense of power and did have some power in the legislature, but they've got lots of gimmicks to prevent you from getting your legislation through. But so then we sponsored Prop 20. I was the chairman of the California Coastal Alliance. Again, just kind of a front group. And so we kind of had the bit in our teeth where we got 55% of the voters to protect the coast. And we decided that, we ought to keep that group together in some form, and so we formed the California League of Conservation Voters with those 110 organizations. Conservation, environmental groups, and so on didn't have a commonality other than name to act in unison and get things done. And
this is a C4, right? So
C4,
that it could,
a
501c4, meaning that
right.
It could endorse candidates.
Right.
So that started immediately after that. I didn't know that.
Yep, right after that. And we did some powerful things. as a statewide organization. And we tried for a number of times to get an LA branch going, and failed at that, and the Sacramento branch, and so the local branches didn't work very well, but the San Francisco main office got a lot done, and after 5 years or so, Carl Pope was heading it up then. Now they had a Sierra Club, and he decided we ought to be out there at the grassroots level with a canvas operation. So we contracted with the Clean Water Group in the East Coast. Clean Water Group had been successful in forming a canvas in the states surrounding Washington, D.C., and getting a grassroots pressure on Congress to pass the Clean Water Act. And so they really knew how to organize canvases. So they brought people out here, and we hired them to do canvas work for a lead conservation voter. We had up to 100 canvassers some nights in the Bay Area, working on various issues, getting the right people elected, and working on issues themselves at the legislative level. Very seldom getting down to the local county level in our activities. We'd actually send what we call grizzly bears into assembly campaigns and Senate campaigns to help out in getting good progressive candidates elected.
What do you mean by that, grizzly bears? Are you talking about a...
We pick the outstanding canvassers and send them with salary into a Senate race or a assembly race to...
as a candidate?
No, not as a candidate, just to help the,
I see.
the local candidate. Right.
Okay. And so you were involved with that for quite a long time?
Yeah, I was on that board. I was in the founding board and left after 9 years.
To start the Sonoma County Conservation Action?
Yeah, that's... I always thought we should have these local chapters, but we had been burned enough times that we didn't want to do that as the league. But I always felt that we should apply some of the same techniques at the local level. So I took the best canvasser they had, Mark Green, and he wanted to get out and go back to Sonoma County, and he came up and we organized Sonoma County Conservation Action. And we've been knocking on doors for 17 years, 75,000 doors a year, and we've moved some major issues in that county at a grassroots level.
Well, I was very interested to read, because I didn't see what happened with it, with the light rail. Did that happen?
Well, the legislature put Marin and Sonoma County together in an rail authority to resurrect the rail line that goes through both counties and through about 14 cities right in the center of them. It's a perfect string of pearls to start a rail. Public already owns the right-of-way. And so we had to get a 66% vote, and Conservation Action got a 71% vote in Sonoma County, but Marin missed it by only having 57%. We missed it by a percentage point or something.
What a shame.
So we're back at it this fall.
You are, okay. Well, before we stop, I want to ask you about your thoughts as we face the, we've been facing it for quite some time, but it's become higher up in everybody's mind, the challenge that global warming presents. And there's talk about bringing, nuclear power plants were dead ever since 3 Mile Island. That was what, 70 or something like that? Mm-hmm. And so 35 years, 37 years, they've been dead, and now they're resurrecting again.
Right.
What do you think about that?
Well, they still yet to perfect a technology that takes care of the waste. And I think they have improved those plants, no doubt about it, compared to the thing they want to build in Bodega Head. As I say, it was essentially a boiling tea kettle type of operation. So that part I would endorse, but you got this other side, and what do you do with that waste that stays around for 100,000 years? It's just, mankind is crazy to develop that much waste that's going to be around that length of time. The other argument is, you know, if everybody gets into producing electricity from this source, they're going to start running out of uranium. They don't know what that total supply is. And I think in this real breakthrough we're facing now, where we have to shift from the carbon situation to other forms of power, there's going to be so much innovation and technology applied that it's going to make nuclear energy kind of ancient and a big mistake. We can do it with other sources of power without endangering future generations with that waste.
And what do you think about wave technologies with regard to the California coast? Do you think that those will be disruptive and unattractive?
I think they'll be disruptive, but we ought to try one, find out how it works. Nothing wrong with that. You can always pull it out of the water.
That's true.
One thing you can't do with a nuclear power plant.
That's very true.
That's one of the other problems with nuclear power, that they have about a 25, 30-year life, and then they have to be taken apart. That's an enormous capital cost to only last for 30 years. When we're thinking about green building now that should last 300 years. We can't throw away resources that way. Right.
Bill, it's been my great pleasure to have you here with me tonight. And anything else you'd like to impart? What are your plans for the future? Enjoying yourself, I hope?
Not until we get the rail passed.
Okay.
I was going to go back and talk a little bit more about that. You know, what was the coastal situation when Bodega Head came along and so on. Bodega Head battle was considered the beginning of the new environmental movement by many political scientists. And soon after that, the protection of San Francisco Bay took place. And there are arguments that that was the beginning, but it really was exciting times in the 60s to have an awareness that people started looking around and putting some value on our surroundings. And in Sonoma County, it's ballooned into being considered one of the greenest counties in the whole United States. You know, we have urban growth boundaries, voter control. We've taken the power of the city council away from them and said, this is a boundary, and you come back to us before you can expand that boundary. We passed, just re-upped a quarter-cent sales tax to buy open space. We protected 70,000 acres. Now we have $700 million
really
to spend in the next 23 years to protect Sonoma County's landscape.
That's an incredible achievement.
It really is. And when we put an item before the public that has some aesthetic value, they recognize that. The county has has what we call community separators, so we don't grow together like LA. And the voters said, we're going to take that power away from you too. And they can't do anything with those community separators unless they come back to the voters. We had well, anyway, we've got the voters on our side, which is the most rewarding aspect of the whole thing.
Well, and you have a beautiful county, a very, very beautiful place.
Right.
What's the percentage of county income that comes from agriculture and tourism?
Well,
I guess wine would be another one. I guess that's part of
I don't know
agriculture.
those percentages, but Sonoma County was the 4th richest agricultural county in the nation at one time. and still has a great deal of that tradition now with the wine industry and so on. Still have some dairies. And,
I think it's going to be very important to maintain agricultural areas close to major metropolitan areas in the future,
yes.
so that we don't have to fly our kiwi fruit in from New Zealand.
Exactly. Very good.
Well, Bill, thank you again.
Okay, it's a pleasure. Yeah, right.
Viewers, thanks for joining us for another episode of Heroes of the Coast.